other things. So like the more that we can have sooner, like before September, is better.
Mhm.
So it's not, yeah, it doesn't add. And the reason it just is that city council just wouldn't look at it, like it's not on their agenda to look at legislation between like October, November. They're doing with budget stuff, so they don't even like review stuff then. So
yeah, I mean, the recommendations you certainly get sooner from this task force. I do think, though, and throwing this to the broader task force members, that the funding needs that we've identified and recommended here will not be met upfront, and we're going to need a group of people who are ready to continue to push and engage, whether it's with an opportunity when it gets to council or it's with the mayor, but we're going to need a consistent group that's driving some of that work.
Yes, that would be terrific. Yeah, and I'm speaking purely just to things that like specifically need to be language in the legislation, as opposed to like funding asks or companion policies, or so definitely like fleshing things out more, because the legislation is pretty high level. So that's all that I'm saying. Yeah, I totally need to continue to engage beyond. I just wanted to make sure getting the language right. So thanks for that clarification.
Thanks, Nicole.
Patience, I think it does raise an interesting question about it, since the policy won't be decided until after the budget season. Then some of the asks could still move forward. The funding asks, they're fairly modest right now from the Green New Deal Board for supporting under-resourced buildings that include affordable housing. And the other thing is just to keep an eye on and weigh in on, I think Councilmember Mosqueda made an interesting, I read one of her statements sounded like she was saying we could do more with Jumpstart funding. I may be reading into her comments. I don't want to speak for her, but I think we can do more with, it'll be my comment. I think we can do more with Jumpstart funding. So it may not be important to do that now, because if a BPS policy goes into effect, it's not going to be enforced for many years. But as we've talked about many times, the affordable housing community needs to start responding immediately, and in its upgrades, be conscious of the fact that it will need to comply, and more money and more technical advice sooner the better, and funding to do that. So just a timing issue.
Yeah, completely agree. Planning, preparing case studies, all that kind of stuff, so critical to have, like, soon.
Yep.
After the policy, if it passes. But yeah, and that's part of we are cognizant of just the timing of the policy relative to the budget, and that is our other reason for trying to wrap the bulk of the legislation language up this summer, because we start briefing the mayor, want to start beginning to have some preliminary conversations with council, so they're like aware that it's coming as they're thinking about the budget, so we're not like educating them after the so that is part of what we're doing concurrently, is just that awareness building that this would be coming. So want to make sure that like your recommendations are part of that as we're doing that.
Yeah. Tangentially, Steve, the Jumpstart, doing more with Jumpstart, are we talking about doing more with the money we have, or expanding Jumpstart? Both.
I don't know what I'm talking about. I mean, I think, I'm talking about doing more. I mean, I think by all measures, it's first of all, it's been upheld. It's a fairly modest tax on very high incomes for large companies. So, if, as we're anxious to get the numbers, even the back of an envelope numbers, but we're asking for a lot of support here for affordable housing to upgrade. And my hunch is the costs are going to be more than we have in the Green New Deal part of the Jumpstart funding today. And I think a question for this community is going to be, how do you all feel about the request? Is it you absolutely need the funding before you all can support it, or and is and I talked to some OSC folks today. There will be other sources of funding potentially in the legislation, but all in all, think about it. It's going to be tricky because it could be just support the legislation now, and we'll figure out the funding later. And compliance doesn't happen right away, so maybe that's okay, or maybe it's not. You all will have to think about that.
Yeah. Well, it'll be nice to have a reference to sources of funding or commitment of funding. Because I think it's really hard to just write on it's going to take longer because we know affordable housing has to start earlier. And we're going to need resources to be able to do that. Nicole, are you able to speak to any of the revenue sources that may be referenced in the legislation?
No, not now, because we're just working on it. So I wouldn't want to speak out of turn on that. But certainly, we're broadly seeking funding that's not just Jumpstart fund. I mean, Steve is right, not just Jumpstart funding as part of the policy package, if you will. Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is the moment to have that conversation, but Nicole, since you're here representing, there were a couple of things in the last meeting that were touched about the idea of the city roster and fees, where it seemed like we were indicating, what we would like to do is have that one-stop kind of shop and organized by the city. And then we were hearing that the city, they were feeling like they would be part of process of helping people become certified for work, but that they were not in a position where they would be negotiating fees or potentially creating a roster of businesses. And so maybe if you can speak to that a little bit so that we could address that kind of technical assistance section in what we had in our recommendations.
Yeah, and I was not actually at the last meeting, so I didn't hear that conversation, unfortunately. So I'm unfortunately not feeling very prepared to address that. Yeah, I mean, that's just a challenge for the city to be in that position of where we're negotiating fees. I think it's something we'd have to kind of explore legally if we could do that. And I will say honestly, not my area of expertise. And Jen, I don't know, Jen, if you have comments on this based on kind of your experience from OH. But I would say, broadly put it in your recommendation. We can explore if it's feasible. I just can't tell you right now what is, because it's a tricky position for the city to be in.
I don't have any comments on that directly, Nicole. I would also agree it's tricky. We're in a position, for example, where we can give you a list of contractors that have successful for fees, it's like we negotiate prices, but sort of for work that we pay for and contract for. And I think that is a different question if there's we're negotiating the fee or getting competitive pricing, but then there's a different entity using it. So, something to be explored, I think.
And then Jennifer, you kind of went a little bit in and out for me, so I'm just going to make sure I heard what I thought I did. So I was hearing that, and this was something that Sandra brought up, that, may not be a legal scenario where they could negotiate fees with private entities. But I guess I'm also thinking about that other half in terms of being able to build that support list for technical resources. I understand that definitely the city would be involved in saying, this is what certification looks like for this particular task, and, making sure. So is it a possibility where there will be a little bit more of that? There is a roster of providers who have met certification, so at least there's a beginning stop for people as they start to look for technical assistance.
I don't know if Nicole, I will say we, for example, with our home repair program, have a roster of contractors that have met certain sort of concrete standards, right? But we say we can't recommend them. You should still call, you should get bids, you should check references. But as you say, it's a starting place so that somebody doesn't have to, go onto Google and do an internet search to come up with 3. We have some that have met some basic concrete standards.
And Steve, maybe you can chime in. I mean, we had Elevate come to one of the meetings who basically kind of were that third party organizer of information, being able to kind of create a contract with the city. Is that something to explore?
Yeah, I think often it happens with utilities. So, Elevate does a lot of work with utilities where they're paid to both provide incentives and services. So, I can't speak for the city at all. My experience, the city has had some lawsuits and stuff, which makes the city particularly gun shy of doing this, but utilities and other jurisdictions in the area do it. So it's not, I don't think there's any legal reason they can't do it. There are some reasons they are reluctant to do it.
So I guess that would kind of just come to the language that we have in that particular section and making sure that we feel that's still reflecting what the task force has been asking for.
And we may want to separate, the funding, the fee, negotiate fee question from the identify, qualified contractor question.
I'm going to go ahead and begin to share my screen so that we can move into what are the current kind of versions. We've done a bit of an edit on the document, and maybe we can just walk through that unless, Patience or Steve, you have another kind of strategy you'd like to take. I'm going to go ahead and start the principles, and then I'm going to let Steve and Patience kind of take it away after that as we move into the recommendations. But in terms of the principles, there was just a little bit of reorganizing. Just wanting to make sure that that's still resonating with everybody here. Again, opening with our commitment to have a net zero carbon portfolio. And again, understanding that, we need to be a part of this process because low-income communities are affected first and worst. And then secondly, kind of moving up the second would be talking about affordable housing residents and then owners sharing in the benefits of efficient and clean buildings. So just making, again, that particular argument where we are saying, there's something to be gained here and we should be a part of that. Again, trying to avoid that scenario where we, leave the table and then kind of become the second-class citizen where we don't get those benefits. And then again, with the energy efficiency. So this has been a back and forth conversation we've been having around efficiency and emissions, but acknowledging that energy efficiency is essential for keeping costs low, that we are tight in budget. And so anywhere where we're going to be saving costs is going to continue to benefit our programming. And it's also something we need to do to be responsible towards the renewable electricity that we have here in Seattle. And then my question was really around this number 4, now that we're talking about the fact that the budget process is going to occur after we are moving forward with kind of the recommendation process and the consideration of the legislation. We have a pretty clear statement that we're expecting that we should not financially or operationally be burdened relative to the current status quo. And I'm wondering if that statement feels strong enough and is strong in its kind of simplicity, or if there is anything that needs to be added in there now that we are really in this process of saying we're asking for things, but we're not going to actually know if there might be funding available. So I'm interested to see what people think about that number 4. Yeah, Robert.
Is that, I guess I'm a little confused on what number 4 is supposed to be conveying, that the building performance standards would not financially or operationally burden the affordable housing provider forever, or is that like, I mean, generally speaking, there is a burden initially, whether that just be from retraining or whether that be from a one-time financial commitment that pays itself back over time. Like, I guess I'm a little confused as to, are we saying there should be zero financial investment and zero training investment? That seems a little naive.
And Steve, you want to just go ahead and head in here? Yeah.
Yeah, I can tell you the intent here, and maybe it's not worded well, and we can tweak it. I think the idea is that affordable housing is run on very tight budget, and currently plan for normal replacement of material, and that's of equipment and normal operating costs, and that's the status quo. And maybe status quo should be more sort of the, current status quo and future trends. So if there's inflation, affordable housing community knows they're going to have to pay more for things in the future. But the BPS policy has the potential to say, well, all of a sudden there's this whole new cost of electrifying, changing my heating system to an electric system that's going to cost me $1 million that I have not anticipated at all. And I think the idea was to say, if I've been planning for a $500,000 replacement with a new, gas boiler, okay, that's reasonable that an affordable housing owner should pay that, but not the extra $500,000 to go electric. That's sort of the intent, because
Okay.
The affordable housing community, unlike others, and it's a question whether we want anyone to raise the rent, but the affordable housing owners can't even raise the rent, right? They're sort of locked into what they can charge. So I think that was the intent. And I think we've talked a bit about the incremental costs, and maybe that's a better way to term it. Incremental cost above the current status quo or something like that.
Yeah, okay. I completely understand the intent. I'm not sure I'm totally on board with the wording, but yeah, I get it.
Steve, can I ask a follow-up question to that? Is it implicit in here is the idea that in order for not to have an additional financial burden, that there needs to be resources available to pay for the delta? Because I think that's what this means. And if so, I think it should maybe say that more explicitly.
Yes, well, either or, I think, Jen, is the answer. I mean, I think we've said that the housing community generally wants to comply and wants to have better buildings, but doesn't want to be burdened, which then does imply that, yes, there would be resources to help for the housing community make the changes necessary.
But it's really meant to underscore the funding need. So if that line doesn't say it enough on its own, we can tweak that to reflect.
Yeah, I mean, my observation is that, some of the other principles are really that affordable housing providers and residents also deserve to share in these benefits. So reading through it, I kind of am working through the assumption that, like, okay, we do want them to participate. so we don't want them to sort of not be burdened by having an opt-out, you know, like, I just like, it didn't quite flow for me. I mean, I think if the intention is to say, we really think there needs to be resources so that there isn't an additional burden, it might just be helpful to say that explicitly.
Yeah, I 100% agree with what Jen's saying. I think the more explicit it can be will help the city respond better, because I too, when I read that, I thought, oh man, there might be just a response to be like, all right, we're just gonna just not have affordable housing be part of this at all. And I don't think that is what you're saying, because they won't really understand the nuance. I think those words like incremental costs and the I think comments that Jen just made are really key, and as well as, you know, Robert's clarifications on it too, be helpful. So.
All right, well, we have a little bit of work to do there, and we'll move forward with that. So just looking at number 5 here, are we having that same feeling of understanding what this is saying? Basically just trying to set forward the idea that, you know, the policy should recognize the difference between buildings that are built at different times to different standards and in different environmental circumstances. And I guess my question to that is, that seems like we can all shake our head and say yes, but are we getting the secondary level of meaning to that, and what might that be, and could it be more direct?
I will just comment, certainly understand difference between buildings built at different times and standards. I'm not sure exactly what you mean by different environmental circumstances. That is, I'm not sure what that is. So maybe if that could be expounded upon, that might be helpful.
Is this the comment of like, at one point, buildings were putting gas in and now they're not? And so are we going to be penalized for having a gas system? And I'm seeing a lot of heads shaking yes to that. I don't know, my comment would be, well, isn't that just wouldn't that be incorporated into the timing and compliance dates? I mean, if a compliance date's 2036 or something like that, right? You know, and you have, I don't know, I'm going to make this up, you know, 5 more years left on the life of the gas, you know, boiler system. Okay, so you get a 5-year extension, and we're until, you know, something that you still, I mean, the gas is bad. It's bad for the environment. It's bad for people's health. It's bad for everything. So I don't know. It seems like we shouldn't just say we're not going to replace gas systems because we put them in at a time when, you know, it was more beneficial or whatever the case might be.
Well,
I don't know.
You know, I think this gets back to the point made for the previous one. So, you know, I think what you're saying is we shouldn't say just recognize the difference, but recognize and support, you know, proactive implementation in buildings built at different times, blah, 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 blah. You know, help to make sure it happens. And you're right, Robert. I think the exact intent here was to say some building built in the 40s when everything was all electric is going to have relatively easier time than a building built in the 80s when everything was all gas, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
and that's sort of not the building owner's fault. And they had a building that was built under, you know, under different circumstances. That's what the intention was here. And maybe we just need to be way more clear than just state it.
Oh yeah, we might just be able to just say to different codes and standards, because that would kind of cover what was allowed in terms of, and what was common practice, you know, common building practices. It'd be explicit, you know, there was a time when gas was...
and cost differences, you know, there was a while when gas was just a cheaper way to go.
Because I'd seen these before. Honestly, it'd been a while since I looked, and I was like, environmental circumstances, like it was like climate, temperature. Like I got really confused by that statement. So maybe my brain was just going in a different direction.
Well, figuring out the exact words to say is tricky, but I think we're all agreed on the intent. So maybe we just use a lot more words to make sure it's really clear.
All right, Steve, do you want to help us kind of move through this section?
I'll jump into a couple of things here. one of the things, the biggest change here is we had listed kind of at the bottom was an alternative compliance path, kind of implying that, affordable housing should really comply via the emissions targets, but as an exception could comply via a prescriptive path. And I think what we heard from everyone, especially at the last meeting and hearing and so on, was that we just want there to be multiple options from the start, not like an exception, not you have to jump through hoops to do that, but you can do either or. So we moved this prescriptive compliance path suggestion up, which is just say, there's just two paths to do it for affordable housing in particular, and consider that. So that's one big change. The other is on B here, and this, I think we heard this from Sandra. I'm not 100% positive, but it came up in the meeting one way or another, was to say, essentially don't require affordable housing to replace equipment until it dies. And when it dies, then require it to be up to the current standard. And, and this could be, I'm curious how people feel about it, because there are gas boilers out there that are 80 years old. So a gas boiler could live another 20 or 30 or 40 years, but it kind of gets back to that earlier conversation that the building would probably live with it for another 30 or 40 years and may not anticipate changing it out. So this is kind of a cost sensitive way to just give an affordable housing owner more leeway to not be forced to change something out on a time schedule, but at an end of life schedule.
Well, and if I remember Sandra's comment in this scenario, it was that she felt adding the beginning of the compliance to be 2036 would address some of those concerns, where you were getting a longer scenario in which to be looking at your kind of asset management portfolio and how you were going to deal with your equipment. And the conversation moved to making sure that regardless of whether or not 2036 was the compliance start date, there needed to be resources effective immediately so that people had a compliance path that they were on, and we would have less of these scenarios where we land up in that. And there was this kind of back and forth in that conversation in which it became, yes, we're doing these things to try and help, but at some point compliance is compliance, and there may be instances in which you aren't at end of life, but you will need to replace in order to comply. So it kind of went back and forth, wasn't completely clear. And in the recommendation would be a way for us to create, that recommendation of we need some flexibility in those scenarios.
And thank you, Bambi. Your memory is better than mine. And I think my example is probably a really bad one. So literally, if affordable housing owner replaced a gas boiler for hot water today, right, it's going to last for 20 years. So it's still good in 2041. And, the current thinking of the implementation it was, I think 2036 was the delayed start for affordable housing. So that would say you're taking a current technology gas boiler and have to replace it potentially before it's worn out,
Yeah. I mean, I keep hearing this consistent theme of, all affordable housing doesn't have the resources, and it's just not my experience, guys. I mean, yes, there are some affordable housing, probably the 25% of affordable housing that's very strained and stressed. All of it's strained and stressed at the time of execution, but well into the compliance period, this is not the case. And there is an opportunity for portfolio management, from refinances to recapitalizations to re-syndications, to create, economic conditions that allow for maintaining affordability, which mostly is always maintained from restrictions, but and also recapitalization. So, I'm not sure that, I think the 2036 and portfolio management with, some exceptions in place are appropriate. But some indefinite timeline that, says, the affordable housing just doesn't have the resources to do it is kind of not really it's giving exceptions that are unnecessary. Or blanket statements that are unnecessary, where you could actually give exceptions where appropriate to take into account the circumstances of a specific building or subset of buildings. That's my experience.
So I think for me, the question is, what are we asking in this scenario? Are we asking for, in those unusual circumstances where even as you've mapped out your compliance pathway, you do land up in a scenario where maybe you're 3 years off or something like that? Are we asking for flexibility? Is that the kind of wording that we're talking about? I mean, I think inherent within the idea of what the city would like to do and what we hope they will be doing is that they will be walking, hand in hand with each building to know what their path plan is. And we would be able to kind of see this coming, because that was something that Sandra had mentioned, they're going to require the reporting and people to assess what their equipment is and to be reporting on that so that it wouldn't be a surprise when we came to 2036. So do we want to just be asking here for, the idea of some flexibility in unusual circumstances where we have a prior to life, end of life scenario?
Yeah, I think if you have an end of life scenario or a pre-end of life scenario, if the building can resource it, okay, fine. But if it can't, then there has to be some sort of funding mechanism to do it, or you're essentially forcing an affordable housing provider to, whether they can or can't, but create some revenue source that is, usually very difficult to do without departing from mission. So, I guess the point is there should be a implementation variance that is allowed if there's a certain window that within which you can achieve the requirements.
And you could go two ways there, right? You could do exactly what you're saying. You could have an implementation time variance, but you could also say that the city needs to work with the owner to come up with the additional funding in order to do the replacement.
I would think both, right? I mean, if everyone's working together and they can achieve the execution, great. Who knows what resources are going to be available in 2036 or 41
right.
or.
To me, I think that's the question. Who's the burden on? Is the burden on the city to say, if we want affordable housing owners to convert, then we have to help find resources, technical and financial, to make the change before the end of life of their equipment? Or is it on the housing provider, which says, you need to do this by 2036, and figure out how to find the money. And if you absolutely can't find the money, you need to apply for an exemption or something. And to me, that's sort of the nuance here.
Trying to put myself like, okay, it's almost like it's on both, where it's on the owner to say, this is what I need, but it's on the city to say, okay, here's what we have, and if you need something different, let's go work together. I don't know. Becky's got her hand raised. She's probably got a great idea.
And I apologize, I haven't been at the last maybe meeting or two, but yeah, I think there's just, you know, putting on the perspective of the owners managing these buildings, you know, they're maintaining a capital reserve or a capital repairs / reserves management plan. Usually it's, you know, and it usually is some 20-year projection, right? And there's always there's usually a difference between what's in that spreadsheet and what actually happens. But the idea, kind of back to like, if there is that menu of things and there's a 10-year horizon, it could be great to say, of that menu of things, here's the things that would be eligible for city light or city or private funds that come to the table money. And then the owner, it would be on the owner to show how to pay for the rest and when. And so maybe, you know, certain things would get wrapped into that refinance event down the road, but the other subset of things, I think, Robert, can be paid for by in sort of a grant or loan to the GP kind of situation. So similar to how Built Smart funds often come into buildings. So, you know, once again, if there's $200,000 on the table, I've seen owners in the past figure out ways to bring that to the building off 15-year, you know, outside of the 15-year cycle. So that, you know, could be an option where you're working with the owner to create this kind of enhanced CNA schedule that they're already used to and comfortable with, and just, you know, in that schedule, you're really identifying, here's the items that are about EPS compliance. That will help, you know, and maybe if they were going to do a double pane window, it's now going to a triple pane, and so Built Smart can, or City Light can come to the table and help bring some dollars.
What if City Light can't come to the table? I think that's my question. Do you still have to change your windows?
I don't know, Steve. That's the idea, that that's where the policy and funding conversations ideally are evolving together.
This is Bobby.
I would just, oh, Bobby, go ahead. I could add something after. Sorry.
This is just, I'm as I'm hearing y'all talk about this particular one, I'm kind of still stuck on the principles thing, but I'm thinking about codes, and that if we're talking about a 10-year horizon from now, codes will have also advanced. We'd be through like 2 or maybe 3 updates to the city building code, and assume energy code as well. And that would affect buildings that we're even building today and having to potentially bring them up to code or whatever that code might be. So just in thinking about the compliance pathway for SHA's properties, that's my concern, is like when we're talking about large systems that affect the majority of the building, we're talking about triggering code in most of those situations. And that is when I start to get nervous. It's not like replacing one piece of equipment or, you know, something like that. It's the triggering of code and having to bring up buildings that are, you know, not even at 2015 building code, energy code. Am I making sense? That's sort of what my brain goes to in worrying about the compliance plan and having a lack of flexibility. So I like the idea of there being some discussion and back and forth and some pathway for deciding whether we're on the compliance track or something else. I think, I don't know if inherent in this is that it's on a case by case building for each building, but I think I just underscores that the importance of that to me.
Well, and I think, Bobby, that's what C is for you right there, right? That's our next one.
You know, maybe the point here is just to say, you know, this is one way of dealing with it, right? You know, we said in our principles that affordable housing wants to comply, right? Wants to move forward and will need funding to do it, shouldn't be burdened, right? So this is one way to consider that. This isn't like, if the city said, we'll find plenty of money, we just want everything upgraded by 2036, fine, right? Then this doesn't need to be there. Okay, so we're not writing the legislation, you know, so maybe we just phrase this as, you know, a consideration to avoid financial hardship is to blank, 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 you know, and just leave it as something for the city to consider if they don't believe there will be funding or aren't sure there will be funding or think it will be a burden. But what we're really trying to do here is just say, you know, to your point, Becky, earlier, you know, if there isn't Seattle City like funding and somebody has a 15-year-old boiler, that's perfectly fine. Are we going to make them tear it out and spend $200,000 5 years before they would? And an affordable housing owner that's trying to keep the building running. I think that's the question.
So yeah, one thing I just wanted to chime in on that might help you with this is we are also, you know, broadly, this would potentially be available to any owner, having a fairly clear guidance on like a hardship provision that might allow, you know, an extension of a deadline. So if it's, and you know, something is just totally impractical because of the timing, doesn't make sense. You know, the equipment is still functional. It's not end of life. If it's so, you know, there may be other mechanisms that could potentially solve this problem or be another out for it. So
I'm wondering if maybe that kind of referencing of a hardship provision is a way to make this particular tenant a little more clear. Right?
That's a good idea.
If we stick that in there, then it's kind of, you know, the overarching logic as you move through here, you can reference it again and again, right? Saying that you're attempting to be in compliance and go along the scenario, but when we get into a scenario where we're there, you know, that's something that we go back to the tenant that we would like to have that flexibility, that consideration. I'm wondering, something else that Sandra talked about at the previous meeting was the idea of the portfolio versus the individual building plan. And I'm just wondering if we can speak a little bit to what that really looks like in a practical way, how that would be, you know, if we're talking about total emissions, is that over the total portfolio and therefore you got the problem child building, and so the problem child building just kind of sits there and you work with all the other buildings, but you get your overall levels taken care of. She didn't quite elucidate what it was meant by the idea of let's look at this as a portfolio concept versus the individual building, each individual complying, because that created some flexibility within these scenarios where someone might just have the, you know, the difficult building.
Yeah. So that is definitely an option that we've proposed specifically for entities like not-for-profit housing providers that, you know, may have 15, 20 buildings, right? All as part of their portfolio. They're holding them for a long time. You know, they meet certain criteria. Same thing with like the school system, for example, is another good one for that. So the idea being that, you know, each year we have these compliance cycles. The larger buildings go first, the smaller buildings go a little later. But like if you're doing work and, you know, 2 smaller buildings are up for work and you're replacing some equipment, like that makes sense to get credit for that. And then you're potentially doing your, you know, your bigger building a little later. So the idea is that you could kind of apply as an aggregate, have an aggregate emissions for your portfolio. And as long as you're making progress for that and like whatever mix of buildings is in there, that could meet compliance. And that helps to recognize like that buildings are all on different timeframes for upgrades.
And I don't believe we have any specific language around that within the compliance recommendations we have here, because I think that was the first time we were getting kind of a definitive referencing to the idea of an aggregate scenario. So, Steve, Patience, are you feeling, Bobby, like we need a letter for this guy in here and should be kind of explicit about our support of that and how we see it working within our sector?
I appreciate you clarifying that, Nicole. When I was thinking of this first, I was thinking it from a little different perspective and not sure how I felt about it because, one portfolio may have a whole bunch of newer buildings that are going to have an easy time complying and a few older ones. And that's great. They're going to be able to comply fairly easily. And another portfolio may just have a whole handful of problem buildings, and which is going to make the portfolio approach really difficult. And I don't know what to make of that. I don't know.
I would stress that it's optional.
Good to rule. Yeah. That's why I didn't have a strong feeling either way.
Yeah, it's not you don't have to, if you own, you don't have to do this. Like if you're Bobby, if you're SHA, you don't have to do the portfolio approach. This is an option.
It just seems like it just sort of randomly giving someone an opportunity to do less because they have a bunch of new buildings, and maybe that's okay.
I have a clarifying question. Nicole, is the portfolio approach, is there any provisions in there where it was kind of like the portfolio total, but no worse than, so you couldn't necessarily cover up, 2 bad buildings with, 18 good buildings, right? You could, but they would be identified and they would have to be on a path of progressing, I guess.
Yeah, I definitely hear what you're saying. That's a concern of ours too. We haven't gotten into that level of detail, but remember there's different cycles over time, and that eventually those buildings are probably going to have to do something. Right. They may just be able to keep pushing it, but in theory, those would be taken care of. I don't want to say they can't hide forever because that sounds terrible, but
right.
You know what I mean?
Some of our financing work, we were doing some bond deals like that where there was an ability to have a certain percentage of them that were not at the required levels, but they had to have in that case, they had to have a stair-step process to by I think it was the term of the bond, they had to be at some point. I don't remember the exact specifics, but it was definitely something where it was a progression. So anyway.
Yeah, the portfolio ultimately, if the theoretical goal is getting to net zero, the portfolio is going to have to all move to that. So this helps, I think, in the first several cycles, and maybe not as much in the last few.
Yep.
For some.
And Nicole, do you think in rulemaking that would be something specific where it would basically say, within the first 2 compliance cycles, and then at some point, rubber meets the road? And do you know what I'm saying? It's this really weird scenario where you're kind of like, I get it, we're trying to be flexible and everyone needs to get there. And at the same time, the whole purpose is that we get there, right? And if we don't, if we can't get there, if we have a lot of exemptions, and affordable housing is saying, we want to be there, but we need the support, or we're going to have, a negative result.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll see, what goes in the legislation and what we need to clarify, but yeah, we can't, we also can't predict funding, what the city budget is going to look like in 2 years. Who would have predicted the pandemic, for example, and the effect that's had on all of us. So I think we try to write it as well as we can, but that's the idea of having, flexible options, things like hardship plans. Like if we're all in hardship, right? Like we're not, if there's no workforce, like you can't, like there's just a certain way that you've got to make it flexible. And that's also the idea of having the rulemaking process be, that's a little easier to open up. So if we find out that something just isn't working, say, in 2036 or something, we can revise the rules. We don't have to get it all perfect in 2023. So we don't know what technologies exactly will be around or whatever.
Right.
Well, I feel like
There's
these
so
are
many
kind of
things. We
more-
can have an earthquake. I mean, like, I don't,
Right.
there's so many things. So
Hey, maybe we'll have a carbon credit.
We're getting a little meta, right? So,
Yeah, so-
maybe we go back into what we've got here with our letters and see if maybe we address some of those in a practical way as we move through. So for example, I mean, I know Bobby is actually heading out, but this one's for you, Bobby. This is the code compliance having to do with substantial alteration code work. And there's kind of two ways to go, and they're both actually in this statement. And so it would be great to have feedback. The code is open to interpretation. And so there is going to be that scenario there where you can have kind of inherent provisions happening within the code process as the person is deciding what's going to happen for you. So we're wondering, do you go with that kind of statement of flexibility and accommodation if we do end up in that substantial alteration code trigger? Or do you just say, we're exempting the idea of a substantial alteration provision if what you're doing is just electrification? So you could say, if you are electrifying a building, that cannot trigger substantial alteration code. Do you understand the difference? Yeah, so I guess I'm wondering, which way do you go there? One is a little stronger than the other, but I think the way code goes and how people read code.
I think one of the things Sandra mentioned, if I remember, is this won't be in the BPS policy. This has got to come from Department of Construction and inspections. So then we can still put a recommendation here, but it would.
So do we want to remove that and just leave it to that point of the conversation when that comes down the road? Do we want to leave it in here?
I would recommend, Steve, you're right about that this has to come, it's SCDI's decision on what they do with the code. That said, I would recommend putting it in, just being explicit that, we recommend that SCDI do X, Y, Z, however you want to phrase it. I'm not going to get into that, but I will let you know that, we've had already had meetings with them. I mean, they're very open to this discussion. So it's not, I'm optimistic they're thinking about it, and they, I don't know what they would ultimately do on a case-by-case basis, but they're certainly cognizant of this as an issue. And so if you're able to recommend it, that only helps, get it very clearly that this is your recommendation.
Bambi, I thought you said it really well with your very clear, like, if you do this, this doesn't trigger that. I don't know, that's my opinion, but.
Well, and I think you can have both
Cleaner,
statements. Right. I think you could actually preamble your statement of requesting that you have flexibility and accommodation, because the logic is that if what you are doing is actually just trying to attain electrification, it wasn't that you were like, doing 1,700 different projects and you got 1,000 people on the site. And, this is the moment in which you're going to really polish up that crown molding. This is the moment when you were trying to electrify. And so you don't want to discourage people from electrification by saying, oh, by the way, once you start doing that hot water heater, if you add this other thing, then we're going to slap you with the trigger. And that's going to, and at the same time, you also want code to be existing because people need to be safe. And so when you do alteration, you need to make sure that you are creating the health and safety scenario. But I do think that lands up being rather specific to you and your code compliance person, and they're looking at you one-on-one. So, I feel like that conversation happens.
I think the other question I have is, and I don't know the code well enough, does it only happen if you're doing the 3 systems at once? But if you spread them out by a year, it wouldn't trigger? And if so, then, I don't think we want to put sort of artificial, when I want people working around the code.
Right.
Just to and it might cost them more money not to do it things all at once, for example, or, you know, in affordable housing in particular, when you have some funny money for refinancing, it might make sense to do everything at once and to not do it at, you know, not do it at once to avoid code would be not financially wise. So yeah. No, I think we have certainly general agreement on intent here and who to recommend it to.
So we're going to just move forward with D here, which is actually kind of interesting because we were putting this in before we found out that we were going to a 2036 compliance start date. And so this has kind of been a back and forth in the conversation about the idea of being able to delay the compliance up to 10 years because of the tax credit timing, where Sandra laid out that, you know, primarily the logic was hearing that we have these different tax assessment processes and the way that we were doing our planning would require more time. And that's why they moved it from 31 to 36. So the question is this something that still needs to be here, given that history? But secondarily, if we do a good job of implementing something different around hardship here in number 4, couldn't we also potentially cover this scenario there? Because we are talking about, you know, where is that scenario going to be where this is going to be an extreme hardship?
So I have a thought here. I think the 10 years is arbitrary. I think we should take that out. I think what we can say here is just we want affordable housing owners to be able to take advantage of their tax credit resyndication.
Yes.
Period. And if, you know, if compliance doesn't start till 2036, then they can do that and we don't need anything else because there's more than 15 years from now. If the final legislation comes down and it's 2028, you know, and the building is due for resyndication in 2032, then we say, okay, that doesn't work so well. So
sorry, Steve, go ahead.
I'm done.
I was going to say the other thing, and I don't know whether it works for a recommendation in here or not, but in conjunction with that is the recommendation, since this is the city of Seattle, what doesn't really apply, but Washington State Housing Finance needs to ensure that they're updating their QAP to align with, you know, the code recommendations. Because if you don't get points, then they're not going to be able to be competitive in the QAP. Does that make sense?
I know we all love the acronyms. I'm going to ask you for the QAP.
Sure. Washington State Housing Finance does the qualified allocation plan, which is their annual guideline to how you get tax credits. And if that QAP requirements or, you know, desires, priorities doesn't align with the code requirements, then, you know, if you have to do XYZ in the code requirements, but you don't get points for that over in the QAP, you're adding cost without benefit, and it'll become a little bit misaligned.
I mean, it would be worth mentioning, Robert. I would say it's also worth noting for the task force and the HDC members to remember how to advance the QAP related policy issues, especially as the point systems are being updated. So that's what that we could coordinate with the tax credit affinity group to be sure to include. Yep.
Good news is they have updated theirs and continually improved their, you know, energy efficiency and, you know, renewable energy and all the different components. So I think they're pretty open to it.
I have a question for Nicole. Something an issue we've kind of avoided from the very start, and I just want to be sure we're not missing something here, is in multi-use buildings, how will they be treated? Because we've been really focused on the residential use only. So if a building has a restaurant, daycare, a health center in it.
Yeah, we will definitely for the, if there, we're proposing sort of GHGI targets by building or space type, if you will. So if a building is say 75% multifamily and 25% retail, it would get a kind of a blended target for that.
But then the owner is responsible for the whole building if they rent out that retail space or that restaurant space.
They would be.
Is there a difference?
Yeah, they would be responsible for the whole building, but what's still on the table and is like, for example, restaurant equipment, like, would that be a part of it? I mean, we're considering an exemption for that type of equipment, at least for the first couple rounds, because there's not really a great, induction cooking is not really like common in the commercial market right now. It's just getting its toes in the residential market, right? So yeah, and then there's becomes questions around, who might own the equipment. But if the boiler is, for example, serving the whole building and the owner owns it, then it's kind of on them, but they'll have a different target.
Yeah,
If I would say if there's a need, I mean, if in the audits, if there's a lot of buildings where like there is a need to treat that mixed use scenario differently, if the multifamily use is affordable housing, that would be helpful to know if that came up in the audits.
Well, the audits, we steered away. We just
Mhm,
wanted to look at
yeah.
the residential
Mhm,
because
yeah.
we don't have it, and O'Brien didn't have expertise at looking at the
Mhm.
commercial spaces. But I'm just a little worried that we may have a fair number of buildings, in Central District and Capitol Hill that are
Mhm.
affordable, that have commercial spaces. And, I mean, I'm assuming you're dealing with that generally with multifamily housing, and maybe that'll just be taken care of. But I just want to.
Yeah, I mean, how does affordable housing deal with that now? If there's something that needs to happen with the building that might affect all the spaces, I guess would be sort of the question. And just making sure we.
Well, I think right
Get into
now, most of the utilities are paid for by the tenant,
Mhm,
commercial tenant, and most of the upgrades are paid for by the commercial tenant.
mhm,
So it's sort of out of hand, but
Mhm.
the building owner is responsible for the emissions, then all of a sudden the building owner is responsible for that space more than they may be today. So
mhm.
anyway, I'm just raising, I just want to see if other people think it's an issue worth raising. It's going to happen sometimes, may not happen enough to make a difference.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to have this in the private. We already have had this with tune-ups to some extent, and that's why tune-ups exempted of think spaces where it's 5,000 square feet and the tenant owned all the equipment, because it just didn't make, the building owner wasn't going to get into that space. So
I think you're dealing with a small percentage of the overall affordable housing portfolio in the city of Seattle. Not to say that it isn't a real thing, because it is, but if we're talking about an affordable housing policy broadly, I don't know if it probably should just follow the city's policy of other mixed use buildings, at least applicable to the commercial space.
yeah, I mean, I think if there were challenges or issues, we would work on that. We will have language about tenant responsibilities, all that. I mean, we really have to deal with that on the commercial side, so we're cognizant of those areas.
So I'm just going to move us to try and clear through this and then be able to get to number 2 a little bit, because we're kind of running out of time. But I'm just wondering, as I see here, like this E about excessive costs, I feel like that could be addressed in the hardship tenant, and so it would be repetitive. And then I'm wondering what people are thinking about this partial credit for best effort, because I feel like it's also kind of another part of that coin, but I'm wondering if that's something very specific that we could speak to a little bit more.
Is that Is that, I mean, isn't that just getting resolved in the timelines and extensions and I don't know.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. I'm wondering if it's pretty much, it's gonna land up kind of within the other parameters. And maybe it's, you know, a vestige of the earlier version when we really hadn't fleshed out as much of those. Steve, do you have a strong feeling of kind of the intention behind this not being addressed in other ways now?
I don't have a strong feeling. And this is kind of vague to begin with, so.
Okay. And then this makes sense that we're going to just talk about specifically historic buildings, but I'm wondering if anyone has anything to add, you know, a special compliance plan for historic buildings if regulations prevent complete compliance, or if compliance triggers excessively costly upgrade costs. I'm wondering, do we need this entire other category here as a special compliance plan, or is this something where, you know, we're looking at buildings of a lot of different ages, and then of course there's registered historic buildings, and so it's important to have that noted out? Nicole, is there something in what you guys have been writing up or considering when it came to historics?
Yeah, and we've talked with historic Preserve Washington and the City of Seattle Historic Preservation Office about this. Yeah, definitely considering that historic buildings would be ones that would qualify for like alternative compliance paths, exempt, you know, extensions, exemptions. I don't know that they need a special compliance like path for themselves, because I think we will make sure that they have some other avenue. You know, also they are part of that conversation with planning, you know, DCI about subalteration as well. So I'm a little wary of special compliance plan, because you start having to create like mechanisms, and it's really not that many buildings. You really ideally want them to just be able to use one of the existing ones. You know, I don't want to speak creating a lot of administrative burden or confusion. We're trying to create a more simple policy of where we can. So.
You know, I just want to remind you, we're not writing the policy here. We're just sort of, you know, you can look at this and say, we're highlighting issues of potential concern for the affordable housing community. So when the policy comes out, you know, we need to look through it and say, okay, do buildings that have to comply with historic preservation, is there something that deals with them some way, right, in the policy?
Yeah.
Is there something that, you know, does the policy consistent with affordable housing finance some way? Is, you know, so on. So again, you know, I don't think we have to wordsmith our recommendations precisely. It's just, hey, city, when you're writing policy, think about all these things, right?
Yeah, you could potentially just consider putting historic buildings maybe in one of the others as like one of the criteria for like you know, your other letters. That's all my suggestion there. It might just streamline it for you.
Well, but I also think there are members for whom, you know, making sure that the historic buildings and were addressed specifically. So I think we'll kind of take that offline and go back and forth and see if we feel that it needs to be a sentence there. Steve, can you speak to the exemptions for energy efficiency standards for small units logic?
Yeah, I don't know that we need this anymore now that the policy is not about energy efficiency.
Yeah. And that kind of speaks to this whole policy and metrics scenario as well, right? Because now that we're doing, you know, greenhouse gas emissions per square foot, are we still needing to indicate?
Let me think about this a little bit. I mean, emissions are still going. If you're electrifying, you don't have an issue. I mean, it could still be an issue. You know, I mean, if you had a gas heated building that you were dealing with of an older building with a lot of studios, it's going to have more gas emissions, and even, yeah, I don't know, hot water. I mean, if we're talking about electrifying everything, it's different, right? Then it's not an issue.
Well,
Yeah.
and then I just was wondering, I think for me, my first reaction to exemptions on studios would be that there are a ton of studios in affordable housing. And if we are exempting out of something that could benefit health and well-being, that we need to be thinking about whether it needs to be an exemption.
Yeah.
So I was
as
just
it's
trying to
worded
get
now,
to-
we should take it out because the policy is going to have nothing to do with energy efficiency.
I just didn't know if we were adding an extra layer, because we did have that conversation over and over about, efficiency and energy, and whether we still just wanted to make a statement of saying, we're all for efficient energy.
But this is talking about the standards. So we know there's not going to be standards in the BPS
Yeah.
efficiency. So it's not to say we won't do it, but this point I think is just moot
Okay.
currently from what we know.
And then we're back here at the technical assistance and standards, which kind of we touched previously, where we were asking for, qualified third-party providers, or city services that can deliver a one-stop shop. Is there anything we want to change in here? Is there anything that, now that we've heard other scenarios around possibility? I mean, and again, this is recommendation, right? So we can ask for things and the city can try to get those things, or the city may or may not be able to make those things. But if we don't ask, we're in that position. So I'm just wanting us to kind of read through this language and see if that still feels consistent. To me, it kind of feels like what we are doing is very specifically saying, we know what we need in terms of assistance, and we'd like to see it. And, whether or not the city is going to move forward in that way isn't truly limiting for us to be able to ask for it. Anybody else? It's looking good, moving forward. All right, okay. So multi-layered funding and financing, again, this was that same scenario, one-stop shop access, so that the funding actually happens and all of the different agencies are brought together to have a successful enactment of the program. And here are our particular needs. We do have this funding to support partial costs, a substantial alteration in here. So I'm wondering if that's repetitive, if that should still stand alone, because now it's in its different category. I'm hoping I'm not paused. I think we're at the end of the day.
I think everyone's just totally faded and burned out.
Yes, I think so too.
I know I am.
I think there aren't many
yes.
folks left here, and I'm just
Yep,
keeping my mouth
no
shut because I am the
no
city.
worries.
I recommend it. I don't know.
I think it should be included in funding. I mean, when we talked about it earlier, it was more unrelated to funding specific needs.
Well, I think given that we're kind of 5-6 minutes out and we've become a lean group, this becomes the HDC work group and the city, and we're hoping to have a few more voices in the room, so we can probably take a little bit of that offline. And it this is where we are. We're still hoping for the audit to come in a timely manner shortly so that it can start to inform some of these concepts we have around funding, because it's very difficult to be knowing what you're asking for if you can't tell, is it $1 million per building or is it 400,000 per building, or what are the averages for this particular scenario versus that. So I think the audit is going to be a really important part of being able to understand how to move forward.
Do you expect to have schedule another meeting to present those results, or what are you thinking about at this point?
It would now appear so.
I mean, I'm really excited to hear what,
So are we. I feel
I
like
hope
Christmas got
I hope
delayed.
I'm not. Yeah.
Christmas got a little bit delayed today. And I think Alistair was saying that it looked like something moving into maybe the next week or so, where they were really beginning to solidify some things, but they were still in the process of, reaching out to Seattle City Light and doing some other things. So,
but maybe later July, potentially, is what you're thinking.
Right now, what we have on the calendar is a July 21 kind of touch base back with everyone. And I am assuming that we would have something to know about the audits before then.
Cool.
But
and can I ask, so that report, like when it's done and you're all comfortable with it, it'll be like a resource on your website, and because I've had people who are like, ask about I've mentioned that this is happening, and people were like really wanting to see it. So I'm excited for it to be a resource.
Yep, and it'll be on our webpage.
Cool.
Yep,
yeah.
With all the fabulous videos they can watch of us all sitting here.
Oh gosh. Well, yeah. I mean, if it'd be really cool to have another more broader lunch and learn, or maybe the lighting design lab or somebody would host something to kind of, get it out there that it's a resource that's available.
And I think that's kind of next steps as we try to kind of close this out. We're in an interstitial space right here in the closeout, and then we move forward from there. Yep. But it is just a few minutes before 4:30, so I think we're gonna call it, and I'm gonna stop sharing so we can see each other and say goodbye. And then I will be in touch with you, Patience and Steve, probably take another hit at the document and send it your way.
Super. Thank you, Bambi.
Yeah.
Thank you. Great.
Everybody who's left.
Great job.
Steve, I'm not sure what the crying emoji was. Are you gonna go home now?
I'm done. 8 o'clock meeting started. I'm fried.
You're toasted. It's time for some sunshine.
Great. Well, great job. And just fabulous job, Bambi, keeping these meetings running. I just wanted to share that. You've been so on it with sending agendas and everything, and really good notes. And just, I know how challenging that is and how much work that takes. So I just wanted to convey that to you. Yeah.
Thanks
and
so much.
everybody, Steve, Patience, the whole crew. Great job. So thank you.
Well, we appreciate you stepping in, and thank you for being our other Sandra here.
Sure. I know Sandra would have wanted to be here, but family called, obviously. So.
Yeah. Well, I always love being the other patients, so it's great.
Right. All right.
Thanks,
Take care.
everyone.
Enjoy the long weekend. Bye.
Bye.